Absolutely. So kind of shifting gears a little bit, I'd love to talk to you about trauma and stress, because I've been really into the idea of trauma. Not to like come at it from like a perverted perspective, like, oh, I'm really digging trauma, but like thinking about the role, the profound role that trauma plays in people's lives, especially when it comes to stress. My own, kind of awakening to this was reading the book, The Body Keeps the Score, and hearing so many of these stories. And they're all stories that were so unique and so incredible of people who have dealt with such severe trauma. And you start to realize these people are just around us all the time who have dealt with really severe things. And it's like, sometimes you hear these stories on the news, you hear them in the newspaper, and you're like, oh my God, these poor people. And then you forget about it. And then you have to realize like, oh, that person who got kidnapped, and was held hostage or whatever, they're still living. They're still like living their life, and they have to live with that experience. And, people have anything from that severe to just, like little traumas that happen. Like their parents didn't get them the right flavor ice cream they wanted when they were 5, and they threw a temper tantrum outside the Baskin Robbins, and somehow that creates a little bit of trauma. And as we grow up now, that trauma plays a role in our stress response to things, and people carry that stress response and it genuinely affects them. So I'd love for you to maybe kind of go off a little bit on how these sorts of traumas affect our lives, and maybe something that can help set people on the right path. Not obviously medical advice, but things that you've seen that typically help these situations.
Sure. So I think just taking a step back, I think one thing that's worth mentioning is growing up Jewish in the Jewish community. I think it is we're very intimately acquainted with trauma because there's been so much of it in the 20th century in particular that dramatically affected our families, that affected the way that we interrelate with non-Jewish people in the community, or even Jewish people within the community, or the way that our families might have opened up to trusting the government, trusting others in and around us as we were growing up, because there was a lot of distrust that occurred in the 20th century that resulted in the deaths and traumatization and persecution of millions and millions of Jewish people. And so I think for us growing up, at least most Jewish people that I know, it was pretty hard to ignore the impact of trauma on not only our parents and our grandparents, but also that got passed down to us. And there was a certain amount of anxiety, a certain amount of angstiness or neurosis or worry that gets passed down over time, which has now been shown in a large extent by Dr. Rachel Yehuda, who directs the trauma department at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, that this content, these experiences, when somebody gets exposed to severe trauma or intense, meaningful, negative experiences over time, if it's not resolved, actually affects the expression of stress response genes like cortisol and the way cortisol is received. And that actually gets passed down over generations to children, to our offspring, if it's not resolved. So this is really interesting, right? Because at first we used to think that, the only effects of trauma are on me because I was traumatized, or I had these difficult experiences that I had trouble overcoming, that I call trauma. Looking into the past, trauma is a reflection of experiences in the past, right? Not in the moment. It's about looking back. And so when we think about that, we used to think, I was traumatized, so I need to deal with my stuff, and I am just going to be the way I am until I deal with it. And maybe that will impact my children or my friends and family, and maybe it won't. But now we know without a doubt that if people don't process and work through what happened to them, then the cycle continues on over generations, which is really interesting. But I think the important part, and that's really good to know, because once we know that that's the case, then what we can also know from Rachel's work and of other folks who come after her have shown that you can reverse the stress response genes that are changing with trauma. So when you experience one or multiple negative, meaningful events over time that we call trauma, then that are oftentimes very intense, but the intensity is subjective, right? Everybody's different. That this is causing changes to our stress response gene expression patterns in our bodies. And that if we allow that the effects of the trauma to continue and we ignore it or shut it down or numb ourselves or distract ourselves to it and don't address it, we don't allow ourselves to grieve and process it, then it will continue. And it will continue on a mental and emotional level, and also on a biological epigenetic level that affects our stress response in our bodies, down to our immunity, the way we fight illness, our metabolism, the way we heal, the way we deal with pain, the way we sleep. All of that stuff gets affected. Our reproduction, everything. It's not just one or the other. And when we process that trauma and work through it in psychotherapy with cognitive behavioral therapy, for instance, or other kinds of talk therapy, and do what's called extinction practices, where you learn to retrain the brain to not perceive that situation as threatening or fearful, then those biological changes actually decrease or go away completely on the epigenetic code. And that correlates with the symptom improvement that people report. So there's a really interesting thing here now that people used to, I think, be told, you've been traumatized or you have a mental disorder, mental health disorder. That means you're sick for life. You require medication for life. This is never going to get better. And I think the beauty of what's coming out of Mount Sinai and Rachel's work and the work of these others who come after her are that that's actually not the case at all, right? So it's very promising to know and exciting to know that no matter how much trauma, negative, intense, meaningful events that you've personally had, no matter how much you feel you've suffered or people in your family have suffered, the cycle can end with you, right? This can stop now. And we know also that hurt people. If we don't deal with our own trauma, we will traumatize others. And that could be friends or family or loved ones or what have you. So it's critical that we recognize that not only do we have the ability to stop the cycle now, but we actually can make changes in our lives that can shift our biology and the way that we feel. It's not just one or the other, and it can be long lasting over time, over potentially years or decades, and will actually impact our children's biology, right? And that's a really, really powerful takeaway. This is changeable. We are not sick forever when we've been traumatized, and we actually do have the ability to heal.